The 12th maid never lasted more than 3 days. That was the first thing I learned before anyone even bothered to tell me my schedule. They didn't say she quit. They didn't say she found another job. They only lowered their voices whenever they mentioned the people who came before me, as if the walls of Stirling Manor had ears. Looking back now, I wish I had listened to the silence instead of the words. My name is Grace Bennett, and on the morning I accepted the position as the live-in maid for Ethan Stirling, the richest man I'd ever heard of, I believed I was walking into the opportunity of a lifetime. I didn't know I was stepping into a house where laughter had become a forgotten language. Rain tapped gently against the windshield of my aging Honda as I drove through the towering iron gates just after 7 in the morning. The estate stretched farther than I could see, hidden behind ancient oak trees and perfectly trimmed hedges that looked as though someone measured every leaf with a ruler. Even through the drizzle, the mansion seemed less like a home and more like a museum built for someone who had forgotten how to live inside it. The tires crunched across a long gravel driveway until I reached the front entrance where a man in a charcoal suit waited beneath a stone archway without an umbrella. He stood perfectly still despite the rain, hands folded behind his back, his expression calm enough to make me wonder if he had ever smiled. "Miss Bennett?" he asked. I nodded. "I'm Arthur Collins, the estate manager. Welcome to Stirling Manor." His voice was polite, but it carried the same careful distance as the mansion itself. He helped me with my single suitcase and guided me through enormous double doors into a foyer so quiet I could hear the ticking of a grandfather clock somewhere in the distance. Everything smelled faintly of polished wood, fresh lilies, and expensive coffee that no one seemed interested in drinking. As we walked, I noticed something unusual. There were employees everywhere, yet no one spoke above a whisper. Housekeepers dusted marble tables without making eye contact. Gardeners passed enormous windows outside like silent shadows. Even the security staff moved with rehearsed precision, each step measured, each glance deliberate. It felt less like working in a billionaire's home and more like following invisible rules no one dared explain. Arthur stopped beside a grand staircase and finally looked directly at me. "There are only 3 rules you need to remember," he said. "Be punctual. Respect the schedule. And never disturb Mr. Stirling unless he speaks to you first." I almost laughed, thinking he was exaggerating, but his face never changed. "Does he usually talk to the staff?" I asked. Arthur hesitated just long enough for the silence to answer before he did. "Rarely." He handed me a brass key. "Your room is on the 3rd floor. Breakfast is served for the staff at 6. Mr. Stirling eats alone. Always. Alone." The word lingered in my thoughts as I climbed the sweeping staircase, passing portraits of generations I didn't recognize. Every room looked immaculate, untouched, almost frozen in time. There wasn't a single family photograph anywhere. No signs of birthdays. No vacations. No evidence that joy had ever lived here. Only perfection. Perfect floors. Perfect walls. Perfect silence. When I reached the 3rd floor hallway, I paused beside a tall window overlooking the endless gardens below. Somewhere beyond those trees was the city, full of noise and traffic and ordinary lives. Up here, it felt like another world entirely. I slipped the key into my room, set my suitcase beside the bed, and noticed a small folded note resting neatly on the dresser. It contained only one sentence written in careful handwriting. "If you're reading this, you're already farther than the rest of us ever got." I must have read that note a dozen times before I finally slipped it into the drawer beside the bed. The handwriting was steady, almost elegant, but the message settled in my chest like a stone. Farther than the rest of us. Whoever had written it had expected me to leave. Maybe everyone did. I unpacked the few clothes I owned, tied my hair back, and followed the schedule Arthur had handed me. Every minute inside Stirling Manor seemed to belong to a clock I could not see. At exactly 8 o'clock I began dusting the east hallway. At 8:30 I polished the library shelves. At 9:15 I watered the orchids in the glass conservatory. No one needed to remind anyone what came next. The employees moved like musicians who had memorized the same song for years. Only I kept missing the rhythm. Around mid-morning I found myself beside a young housekeeper arranging fresh flowers in silver vases. She looked about my age, with tired blue eyes and hands that never stopped working. "I am Grace," I whispered. She glanced around before answering. "Emily." Then she lowered her voice even more. "Do not ask questions if you want to stay." Before I could respond, she hurried away as though even those few words had been dangerous. The silence followed me from room to room. It lived inside the polished floors, inside the enormous windows overlooking acres of perfect gardens, inside every untouched piece of expensive furniture. There were signs that someone maintained every inch of the estate, but none that anyone actually enjoyed living there. A grand piano sat in the music room without a single fingerprint on its glossy surface. A fireplace large enough to warm 20 people held neatly stacked logs that had clearly never been burned. Even the books in the library looked arranged by color rather than by someone who loved reading them. Just before noon Arthur appeared beside me without making a sound. "You will prepare the west sitting room," he said. "Mr. Sterling has a meeting in 1 hour." I nodded and carried fresh linens into the room. Everything already looked spotless, yet I smoothed the cushions, aligned every chair, and wiped away dust that only sunlight seemed able to find. When I reached the floor-to-ceiling windows, I noticed a single coffee cup resting on the corner table. The coffee inside had gone cold. Beside it sat an untouched breakfast plate. Dry toast. Fresh berries. Scrambled eggs that had never been eaten. Whoever lived here had enough money to buy anything in the world, yet had skipped the simplest meal of the day. Without thinking, I gathered the tray. "Leave it." The voice behind me stopped me so suddenly that my heart nearly forgot its next beat. Calm. Deep. Controlled. I turned slowly. Ethan Sterling stood near the doorway wearing a navy suit that fit him perfectly, though somehow it looked as though he had slept in it. He was taller than I expected, with dark hair brushed neatly back and pale gray eyes that seemed almost colorless beneath the afternoon light. There was nothing dramatic about him. No raised voice. No anger. Just an unmistakable presence that made the room feel smaller. His gaze moved from the breakfast tray to me. "No one touches my things." I swallowed. I thought it had been forgotten. He held my eyes for one long second before answering. "I never forget." I expected him to walk away after that. Instead, he remained exactly where he was, his attention fixed on me with the kind of quiet intensity that made every second feel longer than the last. I lowered the breakfast tray back onto the table as carefully as I could. "I am sorry," I said. "I was only trying to help." His expression did not change. That assumption has cost many people their jobs. The words were calm, almost conversational, but they carried enough weight to make me understand why the mansion breathed in whispers. I waited for him to tell me to leave. He did not. He simply reached for the untouched coffee, took a single sip, and placed the cup back exactly where it had been. Cold. He did not seem to notice. Or perhaps he simply did not care. "Arthur gave you the rules," he said. "Yes." "Then follow them." I nodded once. "I will follow the rules that help me do my work well." For the first time, something shifted behind his pale gray eyes. It was almost impossible to notice, but it was there. Surprise. Not anger. Not amusement. Just the brief recognition that someone had answered him without trembling. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. The grandfather clock somewhere beyond the hallway marked the quarter hour with soft chimes that echoed through the enormous house. Finally, he stepped around me and walked toward the windows overlooking the gardens. Rain still covered the glass in thin silver lines, turning the outside world into a watercolor painting. "How long have you worked here?" he asked without turning around. "Since yesterday." "Then you do not know this house?" "Not yet." "You think you can change it?" The question caught me off guard. I thought about the silent employees. The untouched piano. The cold breakfast. The note waiting in my room. I chose my answer carefully. No. I think houses change themselves depending on the people living inside them. He looked out at the gardens for another long moment before speaking again. Interesting. It was only one word, but it felt like the first genuine conversation anyone had dared to have with him in years. A knock interrupted the silence. Arthur entered carrying a leather portfolio. He froze the instant he saw me still standing in the room. His eyes widened just enough for me to notice. "Sir," Arthur said carefully. "The board members have arrived." Ethan nodded once. "I will be there in 5 minutes." Arthur glanced toward me again, almost expecting an order that never came. Instead, Ethan picked up a folder from the desk and walked past both of us without another word. The soft sound of his footsteps disappeared down the hallway until only silence remained. Arthur waited another few seconds before turning toward me. "What happened?" he asked quietly. "Nothing. You were alone with him for nearly 10 minutes. Was that unusual?" He let out a slow breath. "Miss Bennet, none of the previous maids managed more than 30 seconds before asking to be reassigned." I blinked. "Why?" Arthur studied my face as though deciding how much he should say. "Because most people fear powerful men." He paused before adding, almost to himself, "You looked at him as though he were simply another person." I watched the rain sliding down the windows where Ethan had been standing only moments earlier. Somehow the room still carried his presence, quiet and impossible to ignore. I had come to Sterling Manor believing I was there to clean one of the largest homes in America. Standing there with Arthur's words echoing in my mind, I began to wonder if the mansion itself had never been the thing that needed cleaning. The day settled into a rhythm that felt strangely timeless. Every morning I woke before sunrise, dressed in the quiet light filtering through my small attic window, and stepped into hallways that already smelled of fresh coffee, polished cedar, and lilies that someone replaced before dawn. I began noticing things no one else seemed willing to acknowledge. Mr. Sterling never entered the dining room before everyone else had disappeared. His breakfast was always prepared with perfect precision, served exactly at 7:30, and almost always left untouched. Every afternoon another fresh pot of coffee appeared in his study, and every evening the first cup still sat there, long cold before midnight. The kitchen staff prepared elegant dinners worthy of expensive restaurants, yet the plates returned almost as full as when they had left. It was as though the mansion had mastered the art of serving a man who had forgotten the purpose of eating. One afternoon I carried freshly pressed towels toward the west wing and noticed a narrow door standing slightly open. Inside was a private office unlike the rest of the estate. The shelves were filled with thick financial reports, architectural models, framed business awards, and calendars covered with meetings scheduled from dawn until well after dark. One digital screen displayed appointments stretching 6 months into the future without a single weekend marked free. I quietly closed the door, suddenly understanding why every room in the mansion felt exhausted. The house reflected its owner. That evening I found Emily carefully arranging white roses in crystal vases. She looked over her shoulder before speaking. "Have you ever seen him leave before midnight?" she whispered. I thought about it for a moment. "No." She sighed. "Neither have I. Arthur says he has worked almost every day for years." "Does nobody tell him to slow down?" Emily gave me a sad smile. "Who would?" Her question lingered with me long after she walked away. The following morning I entered the library carrying fresh linens when I noticed the curtains still closed although the sun had already climbed above the trees. The room felt dim, almost sleepy. Dust floated through narrow beams of light sneaking around the heavy fabric. Without thinking very much, I crossed the room and gently pulled the curtains apart. Warm morning sunlight spilled across the hardwood floor, touching shelves that had spent hours hidden in shadows. The room changed instantly. It felt larger. Warmer. Alive. I smiled to myself and continued dusting. A few minutes later footsteps echoed behind me. I turned to find Ethan standing near the doorway with a folder tucked beneath one arm. His eyes moved slowly from the open curtains to the sunlight spreading across the room. I waited for another quiet correction, another reminder about rules I had not known existed. Instead he simply asked, "Who opened them?" I did. Why? I glanced toward the windows where birds crossed the bright blue sky beyond the gardens. Because mornings deserve sunlight. He looked at me for a long moment, saying nothing. Then his gaze drifted back toward the windows as though he had forgotten they could even be opened. The silence stretched between us, but it felt different now. Less cold. Less guarded. He finally spoke so quietly I almost missed the words. They have stayed closed for 3 years. Before I could ask why, he picked up the folder, turned toward the hallway, and walked away without closing the curtains behind him. I watched the sunlight continue pouring into the library, wondering if that tiny change had brightened only the room, or if for the first time in years, it had reached something much deeper. The next morning I woke before my alarm, unable to stop thinking about the sunlight spilling across the library floor and the strange look that had crossed Ethan Sterling's face. It had not been happiness. It had not even been relief. It was closer to recognition, as though he had suddenly remembered something he had spent years trying to forget. I carried that thought with me through breakfast and into another carefully scheduled day. While polishing the long dining table, I noticed fresh flowers waiting in the greenhouse to be arranged throughout the mansion. Every vase held identical white lilies. Beautiful. Elegant. Completely without personality. I remembered something my mother used to tell me when she worked at the neighborhood flower shop. A home should have flowers that remind people they are alive. Standing there among rows of blossoms, I quietly selected a handful of pale blue hydrangeas and soft yellow roses from the back corner, adding them to one small arrangement destined for the library. It was only one vase. One tiny change inside a mansion with more than 50 rooms. I doubted anyone would notice. Around noon I carried fresh coffee toward Ethan's study. The secretary who usually handled the deliveries had been called into town, so Arthur asked me to take her place just once. Before I knocked, I heard nothing from inside. No conversation. No music. Not even the sound of typing. I gently opened the heavy oak door. Ethan sat behind an enormous desk covered with contracts, reports, and neatly stacked folders. 3 computer monitors glowed in front of him, each filled with numbers that changed faster than I could understand. A 4th cup of coffee rested beside his hand, untouched except for one sip. His tie had been loosened, but the exhaustion in his eyes was impossible to ignore. He did not even notice me until I placed the fresh cup beside him. "Your coffee, sir." Without looking up, he answered, "Leave it." I hesitated. For untouched cups sat scattered across the room, each one colder than the last. "May I ask you something?" His fingers stopped moving across the keyboard. Slowly he looked up. "Most people do not. Why order coffee if you never drink it?" His eyes rested on me for several quiet seconds. I expected another reminder about boundaries. Instead he leaned back in his chair and looked toward the window. "It reminds me to take breaks." I glanced at the untouched mugs. "Does it work?" The corner of his mouth almost moved. "Almost. Apparently not." I smiled before I could stop myself. "Then perhaps the coffee is not the problem." The room became silent again. Not uncomfortable. Simply thoughtful. His gaze shifted toward the bookshelf across the office where the small vase of hydrangeas and yellow roses now rested beneath the morning light. "Those flowers were not there yesterday," he said. "No." "Who changed them?" "I did." "Why?" I looked at the soft colors brightening the dark wood shelves. "Because every room in this house looks like it is waiting for something." I thought perhaps one room could stop waiting. Ethan followed my eyes toward the flowers. He said nothing for such a long time that I wondered if I had finally crossed the line everyone had warned me about. Then he quietly closed the financial report in front of him, stood from his chair, and walked toward the bookshelf. He studied the arrangement with the careful attention most people reserved for priceless artwork. Finally, he spoke so softly that I almost questioned whether I had truly heard him. My wife always chose hydrangeas. His reflection lingered in the window beside the flowers, perfectly still against the afternoon light, and for the first time since arriving at Sterling Manor, I realized the silence surrounding Ethan Sterling had never been empty. It had been carrying grief all along. The words stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon. My wife always chose hydrangeas. They explained the unopened curtains, the untouched breakfasts, the endless workdays, and the silence that seemed to settle over every room long after the sun had gone down. I realized I had not been working inside an ordinary mansion. I had been walking through memories that no one dared disturb. The following morning began like every other one. The kitchen staff prepared breakfast with practiced precision. Arthur reviewed the day's schedule. Emily quietly arranged fresh towels for the guest suites. Everything appeared exactly as it had the day before, yet something inside me had changed. I could no longer ignore what I had seen. When I carried the breakfast tray toward Ethan's private dining room, I noticed the same familiar pattern waiting for me. Fresh coffee. Toast. Fruit. Eggs. Everything perfectly prepared. Everything destined to grow cold. I stood there for a moment before making a decision that every sensible employee would have avoided. Instead of placing the tray exactly where it always sat, I opened the curtains halfway, allowing soft morning light to spill across the polished table. Then I moved the chair a few inches so it faced the gardens instead of the empty wall. Finally, I placed the small vase of hydrangeas beside the coffee cup. The room no longer looked like a waiting room inside a museum. It looked almost welcoming. I had barely stepped back when the door opened behind me. Ethan entered carrying a tablet and several folders tucked beneath one arm. He stopped immediately. His eyes traveled across the room, taking in every change without saying a word. The sunlight. The chair. The flowers. Slowly he placed the folders on the table. Who authorized this? His voice remained calm, but the warmth I had heard the previous afternoon had disappeared. I answered honestly. No one. Then who decided to change my dining room? I did. Silence settled between us. Even the ticking clock on the mantel seemed louder than usual. Return everything exactly as it was. I looked at the bright gardens outside the windows. Birds moved between flowering trees while the morning breeze stirred the branches. May I ask why? His expression hardened. Because I gave you an instruction. I turned back toward him. I understand. He waited. I did not move. His pale gray eyes narrowed slightly. Did you not hear me? I heard you. Then why are you still standing there? My heartbeat quickened, but my voice remained steady. Because I think this room deserves sunlight. The air seemed to freeze. No one had probably answered him like that in years. He took one slow step closer. Your responsibility is to maintain this house. Not redesign it. I am not redesigning it. I met his eyes without raising my voice. I am trying to make it feel lived in. His jaw tightened. You seem to misunderstand your position here. Perhaps. I swallowed carefully before continuing. But I do understand loneliness when I see it. The words escaped before I could stop them. The instant they did, I wished I could pull them back. Ethan stared at me with an expression I could not read. Hurt. Surprise. Anger. Perhaps all three. Neither of us spoke. Finally he reached for the vase of hydrangeas. For one terrible second I thought he would remove it from the table. Instead he simply stood there holding it, his fingers resting lightly against the cool glass. Without another word he turned toward the window, looking out across the gardens bathed in morning light. His shoulders remained perfectly straight, yet somehow they seemed heavier than before. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. Grace. It was the first time he had called me by my name. Leave the room. I need to think. I spent the rest of that day expecting Arthur to appear with a polite smile and a final paycheck. Every time footsteps echoed through the hallway, my heart climbed into my throat. Emily avoided looking at me entirely, as though she had already accepted that my room would be empty by morning. Even I could not blame her. I had questioned the routines of a man whose entire world seemed built on routine. I had spoken about loneliness to someone who had spent years hiding behind silence. If I were in his position, I probably would have dismissed me before lunch. Yet the hours passed. No one asked me to leave. The following morning arrived wrapped in soft gray clouds. I walked downstairs before sunrise and found Arthur reviewing inventory lists in the kitchen. He looked up as I entered, studying me for a moment longer than usual. "Mr. Sterling has requested that you continue handling the West Wing," he said. I blinked. "That is all?" "That is all." His expression softened just enough to reveal genuine curiosity. "Miss Bennet, I have worked here for 12 years. He carefully closed the folder in front of him. I have never seen him reconsider a decision overnight. Perhaps he did not reconsider. Arthur gave the faintest smile. Perhaps. I carried fresh linens upstairs feeling more confused than relieved. Something had changed, but I could not yet understand what. Over the next several days I noticed something even stranger. Ethan seemed to appear wherever I happened to be working. If I was polishing bookshelves in the library, he walked through to retrieve a file he could easily have asked someone else to bring. If I was replacing flowers in the sitting room, he suddenly decided to answer phone calls there instead of inside his office. Once I found him standing quietly in the conservatory, looking out over the gardens while pretending to read a report. None of these meetings lasted longer than a few minutes. Sometimes we exchanged only a simple greeting. Sometimes nothing at all. Yet I always felt those pale gray eyes observing more than my work. They studied the way I folded blankets, the way I opened curtains before cleaning, the way I paused to straighten a family photograph that had somehow survived the years of perfect order. He never commented. He only watched. Emily noticed it before I did. One afternoon she joined me while I arranged fresh flowers in the front foyer. "Does he always come wherever you are?" she whispered. "I think it is coincidence." She looked toward the grand staircase where Ethan had quietly appeared on the second-floor landing, speaking on his phone while absent-mindedly watching us below. "That does not look like coincidence." I followed her gaze just as he ended the call. Our eyes met for a brief second. Instead of immediately looking away, he gave a small nod before continuing down the hallway. Emily stared after him in complete disbelief. "He acknowledged you." He was simply being polite. "Grace." She lowered her voice even further. "He does not acknowledge anyone." Her words lingered with me throughout the afternoon. I began replaying every conversation we had shared. Every question. Every silence. Every moment when I thought I had crossed a line. I realized something that made no sense at all. Ethan Sterling was no longer avoiding me. He was trying to understand me. Late that evening, after most of the staff had retired, I stepped into the library to return a book someone had left on the reading table. The curtains remained open, allowing moonlight to spill across the hardwood floor exactly where the morning sunlight had fallen days before. I smiled without thinking. Then I noticed a single sheet of paper resting neatly beside the vase of hydrangeas. There were only 6 handwritten words. "Leave the curtains open from now on." The note remained folded inside my apron pocket all day. I touched it more times than I cared to admit, almost afraid the ink would disappear if I looked at it again. "Leave the curtains open from now on." 6 ordinary words, yet they felt like the first crack in walls that had stood for years. The following week the mansion became almost unrecognizable in quiet little ways. Morning sunlight reached the library every day. The hydrangeas stayed on the shelves. Fresh air drifted through windows that had once remained sealed shut. No one mentioned the changes aloud, but everyone noticed them. Even the house seemed to breathe differently. Emily smiled more often. Arthur lingered by the windows with his morning tea instead of returning immediately to his office. It was astonishing how something as simple as light could remind people they were still alive. Ethan, however, continued pushing himself harder than anyone else. His calendar remained impossibly full. Meetings began before sunrise and often stretched well into the evening. More than once I passed his office after 10 o'clock at night and saw the light still glowing beneath the door. The untouched coffee cups had become fewer, but the long hours had not. One rainy afternoon the sky turned almost black before dinner. Thunder rolled softly across the hills surrounding the estate while steady rain tapped against every window. Arthur asked me to bring a fresh pot of tea to Ethan's study because all of the assistants had already left for the evening. I balanced the tray carefully as I knocked. No answer came. I waited another moment before opening the door. The room was unusually quiet. Ethan remained seated behind his desk, one hand resting against his forehead while papers lay scattered around him. The computer screen still glowed with charts and financial reports, but his eyes were closed. For one brief second I wondered if he had fallen asleep sitting upright. Then he slowly opened his eyes and looked toward me. They seemed tired in a way I had never seen before. "I brought tea instead of coffee," I said gently. He looked at the steaming cup. "I did not ask for tea." "No." I placed it beside him anyway. "But I think you need it more." He let out the faintest breath that almost sounded like a laugh, although it disappeared before I could be certain. "You have opinions about everything. Only about the things that matter." He rubbed his temples before leaning back in his chair. "Everyone around me solves problems by working longer." I glanced at the stack of unopened folders waiting beside him. "Has it worked?" He looked around the office as though seeing it for the first time. The endless reports. The cold dinner tray sitting untouched on a side table. The rain beyond the windows. Finally he answered with complete honesty. "Not for a very long time." Without thinking, I walked to the nearest window and opened it a few inches. Cool rain-scented air drifted into the room, carrying the smell of wet grass and pine trees. The silence that followed no longer felt heavy. It felt peaceful. Ethan closed his laptop for the first time since I had entered. He picked up the cup of tea, took one slow sip, and looked out through the open window beside me. "I had forgotten what rain smelled like," he admitted quietly. I smiled without looking at him. "Sometimes the world keeps knocking," I said. "We are just too busy to hear it." He stood there beside me, saying nothing for a long moment. Then, instead of returning to his desk, he left every report exactly where it was and continued watching the rain fall across the gardens with me. After that rainy evening, something subtle shifted between us. Nothing dramatic happened. There were no grand speeches and no sudden transformations. Instead, the changes arrived the way sunrise does, so gradually that you only realized the darkness was gone after the light had already filled the room. Ethan still worked harder than anyone I had ever met, but now there were moments when he paused before reaching for another report. Sometimes he drank the tea instead of letting it grow cold. Sometimes he walked through the gardens for 5 minutes before his morning meetings. Those 5 minutes became 10. No one commented, but every member of the staff noticed. One crisp Saturday afternoon I was dusting the shelves in the upstairs hallway when Arthur approached carrying a small wooden box. He stopped beside a closed door at the end of the corridor, unlocked it with an old brass key, and quietly placed the box inside before locking the room again. Curiosity tugged at me, but I remembered Emily's warning about asking questions. Arthur must have noticed my expression because he surprised me by speaking first. "That room belonged to Mrs. Sterling," he said softly. "Mr. Sterling has not changed much inside it." Before I could answer, he nodded politely and walked away, leaving me alone with thoughts I could not ignore. Later that evening Ethan found me returning books to the library. He stood near the doorway for a moment before speaking. "Would you walk with me?" I looked at him, surprised. "Of course." We stepped outside into the gardens where the setting sun painted everything in warm shades of gold and amber. Fallen leaves drifted across the stone pathways while a cool breeze carried the scent of pine and fresh earth. We walked without speaking for several minutes. For the first time since arriving at the estate, the silence between us felt comfortable rather than heavy. Ethan finally stopped beside a small fountain hidden beneath flowering trees. "My wife loved this place," he said quietly. "She planted most of these gardens herself." I listened without interrupting. He looked across the water, his reflection trembling with every ripple. "She believed flowers should bloom where people needed hope the most." I smiled gently. "That sounds familiar." He returned the smallest smile I had ever seen from him. "Perhaps that is why your hydrangeas unsettled me." He reached down and picked up a single fallen leaf before continuing. "When she passed away, everyone told me time would heal everything. It did not." His voice never broke, but I could hear years of exhaustion hidden beneath every word. "So I worked. Every hour. Every day. If I stayed busy enough, I thought I could outrun the silence." I looked toward the mansion standing beyond the gardens. It was magnificent, yet from this distance it seemed strangely lonely. "Did it help?" I asked. Ethan slowly shook his head. "No. It only made the silence larger." We stood together as evening settled around us. The fountain continued its gentle rhythm while lights inside the mansion began glowing one window at a time. Finally I spoke. "You never stopped loving her." He answered immediately. "Never." I nodded. "Then perhaps the goal was never to forget." He turned toward me with quiet surprise. "Perhaps it is simply to let life continue honoring what she loved." His eyes drifted toward the rows of blooming flowers surrounding us. The breeze carried the scent of hydrangeas through the cool evening air. For a long moment neither of us spoke. Then Ethan looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. It was not the guarded face of a billionaire or the distant look of a grieving husband. It was simply the face of a man allowing someone else to see the weight he had been carrying for far too long. The conversation in the garden stayed with both of us long after the sun disappeared behind the hills. Nothing was said about it the following morning, yet the mansion felt different again. Ethan no longer hurried through every hallway as though every second belonged to another meeting. Sometimes I caught him pausing beside the windows before entering his office. Once I even saw him stop to admire the roses blooming along the south terrace. They were small moments, almost invisible, but everyone noticed them. Even Arthur seemed lighter, greeting the staff with a smile that had become so rare it startled several new employees. I began believing that healing did not always arrive with dramatic changes. Sometimes it appeared one quiet choice at a time. That fragile peace lasted until the following Thursday. Black sedans lined the circular driveway before 8 o'clock in the morning. Men and women in tailored business suits stepped into the mansion carrying leather portfolios and tablet computers. The annual board meeting had arrived. The atmosphere changed immediately. Staff members moved faster. Phones rang without pause. Every conference room was prepared with coffee, bottled water, and presentation screens. Arthur quietly asked me to oversee refreshments for the executive meeting because several assistants had been reassigned to accommodate the unexpected number of guests. As I arranged trays outside the main conference room, the heavy wooden doors remained slightly open. I had no intention of listening, but some voices carried farther than others. One board member spoke with confident authority. "Your recent decisions have raised concerns among several investors." Another added, "Productivity reports show noticeable changes to your daily schedule." Ethan answered calmly. "The company continues to exceed every financial target." "That is not the issue," a third voice replied. "People are asking why household staff suddenly appear to influence your routines." My hands froze around the silver serving tray. I heard papers sliding across the polished table. Then another voice continued. "Several senior employees have specifically mentioned one Maid." Silence followed. Long enough to make my stomach tighten. Finally Ethan spoke again. His voice remained perfectly controlled. My personal household is not a topic for this board. It becomes one when it affects leadership. Another director cleared his throat before speaking carefully. We recommend replacing the employee responsible for these distractions. I felt the color leave my face. Every instinct told me to walk away before hearing another word, but my feet refused to move. Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, there was only silence. I wondered if he was considering the recommendation. If perhaps they were right. I had changed too much inside his carefully ordered world. Then his chair moved softly across the hardwood floor. Grace Bennett is staying. His words were simple. Certain. Absolute. Someone objected immediately. Mr. Sterling, with respect, this is not an emotional decision. Correct, Ethan replied. It is a leadership decision. Another executive asked quietly, on what basis? His answer came without hesitation. The people who improve a home should never be removed from it. No one spoke after that. The meeting continued with budgets, expansion plans, and quarterly reports, but I heard none of it. I carefully stepped away from the doorway before anyone noticed I had been standing there. My heart was racing for reasons I could barely understand. I had come to Sterling Manor expecting to clean floors, polish furniture, and replace flowers. Somehow, without either of us realizing when it happened, Ethan Sterling had begun protecting the one person everyone else believed should simply be replaced. Hearing those words should have made me happy. Instead, they filled me with a quiet sadness I could not explain. Ethan had defended me without hesitation, but the more I thought about it, the more I wondered what that defense might cost him. Sterling Holdings employed thousands of people. Entire communities depended on decisions that came from the man sitting at the head of that conference table. I had entered his life to dust bookshelves and arrange flowers. I never wanted to become another problem he had to solve. For the next 2 days I avoided every opportunity to be alone with him. I finished my work early, changed assignments with Emily whenever possible, and made certain someone else delivered tea or documents to his office. If he noticed, he never mentioned it. The mansion returned to its familiar rhythm, yet something important had disappeared from it. The conversations became shorter. The library felt quieter. Even the garden seemed strangely distant. On Sunday afternoon I sat alone beneath the old oak tree overlooking the lake behind the estate. Autumn had painted the shoreline with shades of amber and crimson, and the water reflected the clouds like polished glass. It was the first place inside Sterling Manor where I truly felt invisible. I unfolded a sheet of stationery I had borrowed from the study and began writing a resignation letter. Every sentence felt heavier than the one before it. I thanked the Sterling family for the opportunity. I expressed my gratitude to Arthur and the staff. I wished Ethan continued success. When I reached the final line, my hand stopped moving. The words blurred together because none of them explained the truth. I was not leaving because I disliked my work. I was leaving because I cared too much about the person who had hired me. A familiar voice interrupted the silence behind me. I have been looking for you. I quickly folded the letter before turning around. Ethan stood a few feet away without his suit jacket, wearing only a light sweater against the cool afternoon breeze. Somehow he looked less like a billionaire than simply a man taking his first real walk in years. I did not mean to disturb you, he said. You are not disturbing me. His eyes dropped briefly toward the folded paper in my hands. What are you writing? I hesitated. Then I decided he deserved honesty. My resignation. The breeze seemed to stop. Ethan remained completely still. May I ask why? I looked across the calm water instead of at him. Because your board was right. He frowned slightly. They do not decide who belongs in my home. No. I smiled sadly. But they should never have had to discuss me in the first place. He walked closer until he stood beside the bench overlooking the lake. Grace. My name sounded different now. Softer. Do you believe I kept you here because I needed someone to arrange flowers? I slowly shook my head. No. Then why are you leaving? I finally met his eyes. Because I never wanted to become another weight for you to carry. Ethan looked out across the water for a long moment before answering. His voice was quiet, but every word carried unmistakable sincerity. You misunderstand something important. He turned toward me with an expression completely free of the guarded distance that had once defined him. You are not another burden in my life. He paused, taking a slow breath before finishing the thought. You are the reason it has started feeling lighter. His words stayed suspended between us like the last golden light resting across the lake. I had expected him to persuade me with logic, with contracts, or with promises about my position inside the estate. Instead, he spoke with a kind of honesty that could not be purchased. For the first time since I had arrived at Sterling Manor, Ethan Sterling sounded less like the man who built an empire and more like the man who had finally stopped hiding behind it. Neither of us spoke for several moments. The breeze carried fallen leaves across the path while gentle ripples spread across the surface of the water. Finally I unfolded the resignation letter resting in my hands. I looked down at the carefully chosen words that had seemed so necessary only minutes earlier. Now they felt strangely distant, as though someone else had written them. I smiled quietly, tore the letter into several small pieces, and placed them inside my coat pocket instead of letting them fall into the lake. Ethan watched without saying anything. I still cannot stay if I become the reason people question your judgment, I said softly. That matters to me. He nodded with thoughtful understanding. Then let me answer them with my actions instead of your absence. We slowly walked back toward the mansion together. The lights shining through the tall windows reflected warmly against the evening sky, making the estate seem less imposing than it had on my first day. Somewhere along the path I realized we were no longer walking several steps apart. Without either of us noticing, the distance between us had disappeared naturally. The following Monday Ethan did something no one inside Sterling Manor expected. He invited the entire household staff to breakfast in the main dining room. Arthur looked genuinely astonished while Emily nearly dropped a serving tray. Several gardeners, housekeepers, chefs, and assistants quietly took their seats, unsure whether they had misunderstood the invitation. I stood near the doorway, convinced I should remain in the background, but Ethan looked directly at me and gestured toward an empty chair at the long table. Please join us, he said. No one questioned him. During breakfast he thanked every department personally for their work. He asked the gardeners about the autumn flowers. He complimented the kitchen staff for the homemade bread. He even asked one of the younger assistants about her college classes after remembering she attended evening courses twice each week. The room slowly filled with conversations that had not existed there for years. Laughter appeared once, then again, until even Arthur found himself smiling into his coffee cup. As I looked around the table, I realized the mansion no longer resembled the silent place I had entered months earlier. It still carried elegance and order, but now it also carried voices. Real ones. Human ones. After breakfast Ethan asked me to walk with him through the front gardens before his meetings began. We stopped beside a row of blooming hydrangeas where morning sunlight rested gently across the petals. Do you remember what you told me when you first opened the curtains? He asked. I nodded. I said mornings deserve sunlight. He smiled, the expression reaching his eyes now instead of disappearing before anyone noticed. I thought you were trying to change my house. He looked around at the gardens, the open windows, and the staff greeting one another as they crossed the courtyard. I finally understand that you were never changing the house. His gaze settled on me with quiet gratitude. You were reminding everyone inside it how to live again. Winter arrived quietly, covering the gardens with a delicate layer of frost that sparkled beneath the morning sun. From the library windows I watched the first light stretch across the estate, touching every path, every tree, and every flower bed that had somehow survived another season. Months earlier the mansion had greeted each day with silence. Now it welcomed the morning with the sound of conversation drifting from the kitchen, laughter echoing faintly through the hallways, and music playing softly from the grand piano that had once gathered nothing but dust. The transformation had not happened because expensive renovations changed the building. It happened because people slowly remembered they were allowed to feel at home again. Ethan remembered it too. He still led one of the largest companies in the country with discipline and determination, but he no longer measured every hour only by productivity. Breakfast became a habit instead of an obligation. Evening walks through the gardens replaced countless unnecessary meetings. Every Friday he invited the household staff to share coffee before the workday began, listening to stories about their families, their dreams, and their plans for the future. The distance that had once separated him from everyone around him quietly disappeared. One afternoon, just before Christmas, Arthur asked me to meet him in the front foyer. Ethan was waiting there beside the towering evergreen decorated with warm white lights and handmade ornaments created by the staff. In his hands rested a small wooden box. He smiled as I approached and handed it to me without saying a word. Inside was the old brass key to the room I had first stayed in when I arrived, resting beside a new silver key engraved with a single word. Home. I looked up in confusion. Ethan spoke gently. The upstairs room will always be yours if you want it. But this key opens the small cottage overlooking the lake. I stared at him, unable to find the right words. You do not have to accept it, he continued. I simply wanted you to know that you will always have a place here, whether you work here or not. My eyes filled with quiet emotion as I closed the box. You already gave me more than a place to stay. He tilted his head slightly. What did I give you? I smiled. The chance to believe that people can change without losing who they are. He looked toward the library where sunlight poured through the open curtains, illuminating the hydrangeas resting on the windowsill. Then we gave each other something valuable, he said. Because before you arrived, I believed success meant building the largest house money could buy. He paused, his voice calm and certain. You reminded me that a house only becomes a home when people inside it feel seen. Snowflakes began drifting gently beyond the windows as everyone gathered in the foyer to admire the tree. Emily laughed while Arthur pretended to complain about the decorations being slightly uneven. The chefs carried trays of warm cinnamon rolls through the hallway. Somewhere someone began playing a familiar holiday melody on the piano. I looked around the room and realized that every face reflected something the mansion had forgotten long before I arrived. Peace. As I stood beside Ethan watching the snow fall across the gardens, I finally understood the lesson this extraordinary place had been waiting to teach me all along. Wealth can build walls, purchase land, and fill rooms with beautiful things, but kindness is what opens the curtains, invites in the light, and gives even the loneliest heart permission to live again.